Hello, welcome to another episode of History in the Dark. I am your host, Darkness the Curse. And before we begin, as always, thank you so much to my generous patrons, my British rail critics, and of course, my underwater train finders. You are the reason why this content remains just awful, hideously terrible. I don't even know why you're watching this video, because it's bad. That's what all the comments tell me. And then I go to bed at night and cry myself to sleep. Is that what you want? And today, we are going to discuss terrible things. Terrible, horrible, just awful locomotives again. Part 18. How many bad trains are there? The British Rail Class 31/4. Son of... You know, the worst part about this is I have no one to blame but myself anymore. It's not even that they keep breaking into my house. I mean, they do. But that's not actually the issue here. I have noticed that every time I don't put British Rail on the list, people are like, "Where's British Rail? I want to see British Rail. I want to see you get mad about British Rail." Which is funny, because whenever I do it, I get people saying that I don't want to see British Rail, it's too much. It's not funny anymore. You're not funny. Your videos are terrible, and I don't even know why you're here then. But it's just one of those things where I'm like, I don't even know why I read comments. Welcome to the internet. I should get used to this by now, and I am. But my point is that I know that British Rail has been a meme on this channel since the very beginning. But I'll be real with you, I am running out of genuinely bad locomotives to talk about when it comes to British Rail. Not everything they made was bad, and I can't keep forcing it, and I'm trying to look and find weirder stuff, but there's only so much that's there. And if I run out, well, I can't make things up. This is historical. I have to be factual. But I did find one more this time. And before anyone gets mad, I am not talking about the Class 31 as a whole, because I'm sure many have pointed out already, and have probably already complained in the comments before even watching the video, because that's usually what happens, that the Class 31 is actually pretty good on its own. It was developed by Brush Traction. They were built between 1957 and 1962, diesel-electric. That time frame suggests they might be bad, but these were, again, one of the ones that came out alright from the modernization plan. They were decent diesels. They were absolutely fine, and lasted quite a long time, actually. The last one wasn't withdrawn until 2017, and 26 are preserved. So, how dare I refer to them as bad? Well, if you were paying attention, I'm referring to the 31/4 derivative of the 31s. These were a subclass beneath them, and they were remodeled with non-ETH, an electric train heating system. And as we've been over before, British Rail kind of had a rough period involving ETHs. They were new, and the kinks hadn't been quite worked out yet. And in the 31's case, it was found that the ETH just did not jive with them at all. And this was mostly down to power output. The 31s, for all their good traits, were always considered a little bit underpowered. Not enough to be a real problem, but they weren't as strong as a lot of the other diesels that British Rail had. As a result, many of their trains that they did pull were shorter than a lot of the bigger expresses. That was fine, though. They still had use for them. However, when the ETH was installed, it just completely wrecked their electric power output. The index for the models they installed was 66, which is equivalent to about 330 kilowatts. That is 1/3 of the total electrical output of the locomotives, leaving only 2/3 for actually pulling stuff. As a result, actually utilizing them when it came to the ETH and pulling things at the same time was not really something they were any good at. Any train that did pull had to be really short, not exceeding 4, maybe 5 carriages tops. Does that make them the absolute worst? No, I put them in spot 5 on this list for a reason, but the 31/4s were not really viewed as a particularly major success, simply because the 31s were just never designed with the ETH in mind, and it was one of those modifications that just didn't go really well. But like I said, in other aspects they did alright, and served for a great deal of time as their reliability was quite good. So outside of the /4 variants, I would comfortably put the rest of the 31s on best trains ever, to be frank with you. Kinda stands as another case of just how easily you can ruin a perfectly good locomotive. The DR Class 119. Behold, the product of communist oversight. The 119s were an East German Deutsche Reichsbahn diesel locomotive, and they were built in Romania. They were technically a development of the successful 118s, and interestingly, I feel like I'm talking about ETH a lot lately, because in the 1970s, the DR needed a locomotive with ETH in mind. Additionally, they wanted an axle load of under 16 tons and a power output of over 2,000 horsepower. These requirements were actually difficult to address. Due to certain political agreements, the East German economy actually wasn't allowed to build a diesel locomotive that was more than 1,500 horsepower, and the locomotive producers of the Soviet Union could only supply heavy engines. That's why they wound up being built by the 23rd August Locomotive Works in Romania, while the actual power units, the engines themselves, were produced by East Germany. But the Romanians actually never did install those engines due to some coordination problems, and that part had to be done by a West German manufacturer, MTU. 200 of these diesels were produced between 1976 and 1985, but they were plagued with problems from the start. Up to 50% of the locomotives were in workshops at any given time, and it was mostly due to the engines themselves. And one of their nicknames was actually Carpatenschreck, which means Carpathian Terror, relating directly to their problems. They broke on a near constant basis. They just kinda had to work around them. In fact, an unverified story about how they did this involves using like 3 locomotives on one line. Every time one would get to a station, they'd replace it with an entirely different diesel, specifically because they were concerned that if one diesel did a whole route, it would break. Now that may be a woeful exaggeration, but they were in the workshops a lot because of their problems, and they're legendary as one of the worst German-built diesels ever designed, which is rare for them. Usually, whether it's West or East Germany, if it's a German diesel, it's probably alright. The 119s are the exception. The Renfe Class 340. Goodness, I hope I'm saying Renfe right. Is it Renfe? Renfe? Or just Renf? What are you? It's Spanish. I don't speak Spanish. Buenos dias, hola. That's all I got. I can't do anything beyond that. They were built in 1966, and only 32 were ever produced. They were actually based off of the German-built diesel, the Class V200. The V200s were really good diesels, by the way, in their original form, and many countries mimicked their overall design, including British Rail. The Class 42 and 43 were both based off of these as well. However, Renfe's Class 340 outing was not great. The V200s had 2 different diesel engines that put out about 1,000 horsepower apiece. It was a little more than that, but close enough. As a result, the overall output of the locomotive was about 2,000 horsepower. But the Class 340s cranked everything up to 4,000 horsepower. Both engines were doing double the work. Boosting engines in this manner can work out alright, but it's always a risky venture, and usually it results in the need for extra maintenance. The actual Spanish railways that utilized these found that when they were working, they were fine, with a maximum speed of 130 kilometers an hour, or 81 miles per hour, but the more they were used, the more problems cropped up. The maintenance that they were providing the locomotives was not good enough to counterbalance the wear and tear on the engines. The series failed many times, overall not being viewed as a particularly successful venture. However, 2 did wind up preserved, so if you're ever in Spain, you might actually be able to see one of these things. The Pennsylvania Railroad Class K5. Oh boy, I can't believe how long I've put this off. I've brought the K5 up a handful of times, usually when I talk about the K4s, because Well, the K5s are part of the reason why the K4s stuck around so long. The K4s were great, absolutely awesome, but over time, they needed some kind of replacement. Their power output was not good enough for modern trains. It resulted in the Pennsy having to double or even triple head them sometimes. They had other larger locomotives that could also do similar work with less crews involved, but they were never really a proper replacement for the K4s, just a supplement. The K5 was the first real attempt to actually straight up replace the K4s. Two of them were originally built in 1929 for testing. 5698 was built by PRR Altoona Works, and the other, 5699, was built by Baldwin. And they sucked. Oh my goodness, they were terrible! Design-wise, their dimensions were just kind of an enlarged K4. They were still Pacifics like the K4s, but they were bigger, with fatter boilers that were a lot closer to the I-1S 210 decapods. Almost everything about them was just an enlarged, bigger K4, and therefore, on paper, they did have much better horsepower. The only exception in terms of their dimensions was the 70 square foot grate area and the 80-inch drivers. But you can't just necessarily scale up a locomotive and not expect different results. They had more power, technically, sure, but they didn't have that much more weight on their driving wheels. This means that, really, they had no more adhesion than a K4 would. It affected their ability to pull anything, meaning they didn't really outperform the K4s at all. If the train was too heavy, their wheels would slip, which is bad. We don't want that either. The K4s may have needed extra help, but they had good adhesion for what they were working with. The K5s had all the power in the universe, but not enough traction on the rails to actually do anything with it. Both locomotives did actually stick around for a decent amount of time, though. In fact, pretty much until the end of steam. They weren't retired until 1953. The reason is that, in some other aspects, as long as the train was light enough, the adhesion issue never really cropped up. Like I said, it was pretty much the same as a K4. Now, it's true this meant that their power meant nothing, but as long as the train was something a K4 could also handle, the K5s could do it just fine. So in that vein, they could still pull things on occasion, and be somewhat useful in that regard, but it never convinced the Pennsy to actually build any more. Because why would they? They didn't perform any better than the K4s did, even though they were technically more powerful. It just didn't make any sense. The FS356. What the heck is that thing? I'm sorry, I shouldn't laugh. It looks like an outhouse on wheels, or like the worst, dingiest trailer you could find in your local trailer park. Stick it on a railway, that's what that looks like. And yeah, it looks like something that was slapped together. And to be fair, that's actually exactly what the 356s are. These were built by Italy during the Second World War, by their state railways as war locomotives. And I think this really encompasses Italy under Mussolini in the most literal sense. Like, the misguided nature of this design, the woeful ineptitude on display here, that is raw Mussolini in every aspect. It's just almost beautiful in that regard. However, these were absolutely atrocious. They were meant to be used by the Italian armed forces in Libya, pulling military trains to supply their troops, and they were built using salvaged parts. Literally anything they could get a hold of to put this thing together, that's what they used. Because it was 1942, World War II was raging, they didn't have access to a lot of parts, proper parts, to actually build a locomotive from the ground up. They're diesels, and they only ever built 4 of these things, thank goodness, because, well, they were terrible in pretty much every category. You could slap together a lot of things for a war effort, and sometimes you wind up with something that's okay. A lot of the war locomotives built by the UK and America were actually pretty good, and in fact, a lot of Germany's were really good. Italy's attempt is not that at all in any real way. Fiat actually slapped these together, and I do literally mean slapped. All 4 were technically classified the same, but they weren't built the same. 001 and 002 were encased with a completely metal body, which is good, but 003 and 004 used a partially wood construction, which is horrifying. Frankly, we evolved well past the need for wooden locomotives. The transmission actually used a clutch unit with multiple discs that connected to a mechanical gearbox of the Fiat type with 4 different gears. In theory, they could reach 50 kilometers an hour, which wasn't that fast even in those days, but it's faster than you would expect out of this thing. But they only delivered 230 horsepower, which meant that they could move themselves and really not much else, which is really frustrating because the whole point of them was to move supplies. If they can't pull much, then they're no good for that at all. This resulted in them actually just being despised by the workers on the railway. They weren't very useful, and they just were kinda ugly in pretty much every regard. I think that's been pre-established. As I'm sure you know quite well, Italy did not actually win World War II. Well, I guess in the technical sense they did, because when they deposed Mussolini, they actually switched sides, so they could be on the winning team, I guess. But yeah, this was ill-advised, this was terrible, and no. No. Though amazingly, they actually remained in technical service until 1960. I still can't believe that. They were all scrapped though, which might have been very easy because frankly they just look like a pile of scrap metal. I'm almost impressed at how much these things just look like trash. And with that, a special thank you goes out to all my underwater train finders. Thomas Ward, Lord Captain Von Thrust III, Sundew 267, Orange Glass, Joshua Long, Ohio Trucker 1, Royal Hudson 2860, Lord Hoth 444, Arthur Roy, Benjamin Owens, Panzer Kitsune 131-232, Mr. Black Rose, Master of None, Josh Johnson, Law Kraken, Twin Fox, Dimeblade 17, Anzac A1, and Dozzy Was It. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.